This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, we're on.
Okay, good morning, Rabbi Sai. Afreilichen Erev Shabbos and Afreilichen Erev Chanukah. We're going to examine in the first segment of today's learning a few points of Lomdus on the classic Gemara in Masechta Shabbos, Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. I'll read to you very briefly. Mai Chanukah, the Tana Rabbanon. You know, there's a famous comment of the Tfer Shleima of Radomsk. Mai Chanukah, what's Chanukah? The Tana Rabbanon. To learn, that's what Chanukah is. Mai Chanukah, Tana Rabbanon, b'chafei b'Kislev. On the 25th day of Kislev, Yoimei de Chanukah, Tamanya Ina, on 8 days of Chanukah. Delay lemispoid behind, or delay lahasanois behind. Not to eulogize, not to fast. Shekishenichnasu Yevanim lehechal. When the Yevanim entered the Heichal, Timu kal hashmanim shebehechal. They were matame all the oil in the Heichal. Uchshagavra malchus beis chashmonai. And when the kingdom of the house of the Chashmam prevailed, Vinatzcham, and they were victorious. Badku, they searched Leimatza elapach echa shel shemen. They only found one jug of oil, Shayamunach b'chaysamish shel kain gadol. V'layhaya bay ela lahadlik yoim echad. Nasa bay neis v'liku imenu shmana yamim.
How many sheets are there? 2.
One, double-sided. L'shana acheres. The next year, Kavam v'asamim yamim tovim mahalav ha'ida. So just an interesting point is that it says the Yevanim were matame all the shemanim. Tosfos discusses over here, how were they matame all the shemanim? Well, l'chayra, very simple. They opened it and they were matame it. They touched it. But then the question is, but this particular jug, this was sealed. So Tosfos is bothered. Even if it's sealed, there's a gezerah d'Rabbanan that goyim could be matame a sealed klicheres beheset. Even though klicheres is only matame mile gav from the inside, but if you move it, if a goyim moves the klicheres, he's matame beheset. So the shaila is, that's a din d'Rabbanan, and we know many of the dinei d'Rabbanan were post Chanukah. So maybe you'll say this jug has been preserved because it's before the gzeira of Tumas Hesed. But Tosfos says even if the Chacham already geyser Tumas Hesed, you'll have to say that it was put in the ground with the seal of the Kohen Gadol in a way that it was never moved.
Was the oil all in little containers or one big vat where they drew off the oil from as they needed it?
I'm assuming that they were containers for daily portions.
Individual containers.
That's what I'm assuming.
Why can't we say Gezerah D'Rabbanan did not apply in the Mikdash?
Because, okay, that's a good point. You want to go back to the Gemara in Be'ah already, right? That's what we just did in Be'ah. The Gemara talks about Ein Shvus B'Mikdash, the concept of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. So, the concept of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash is not in all cases. There are many exceptions to the rule, and Ein Shvus B'Mikdash does not always apply. So the Gemara says, for example, in Be'ah, on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis, the Gemara we just learned, the Gemara talks about whether you're allowed to put on a bandage on a wound on Yom Tif. So the Gemara says that we allow a kohen to put his bandage back on, even though it's a d'Rabbanan, because we're afraid he might not take it off in the first place. So the Gemara says, what's the chiddush? So the Gemara says, the chiddush is, I would have thought he's allowed to do it because of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. Kamash Malan, no, Ein Shvus B'Mikdash doesn't apply to that, it's a d'Rabbanan. So not all Yisur d'Rabbanan do we use the rule of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. Okay. So here's the question. Here's the $1 million question. And this is a question that L'chaira Rabbi Kiva Eger alludes to. Where is there Rabbi Kiva Eger on this Gemara? We have the Goyen Hashas on this Gemara. And all Rabbi Kiva Eger says is Ayin Berambam Parakeh Mehilchos Beis HaBechira Halacha Ches. So obviously Rabbi Kiva Eger is bothered by a question. If he says, look in the Rambam, in Hilchos Beis HaBechira, Parakeh Halacha Ches, and then he says Ayin B'Tshuvas Batei Kahuna Chelek Aleph B'Veis Vad Siman Aleph. So let's try to understand what is Rabbi Akiva Eiger bothered by, and what's the problem over here, and what's the answer. So we have on the sheet over here the question that presumably Rabbi Akiva Eiger is bothered by. Hikshu ha'achroinim haloi hashmanim shenitmu lo'nitmu ela misafek. That's the first premise. The first premise is: you think the Yevanim went around searching for oil and like mad scientists searching for every last thing of oil and sticking their finger in? I guess simply they probably were not well educated in the ritual laws of Jewish practice that they need tahar oil and every jug that they touched. They probably just went in and ransacked the place. But it's doubtful that they Badafka went out and stuck their finger in every single one. Just we came in and everything's in disarray. We don't know what happened, so we have to assume the worst. So it's a suffix. We can't say vadai any particular jug was nitma. Okay, so it's a suffix. Now that's a problem, because if it's only a suffix, we have to know what are the laws of suffix tumah, suffix tara. So there's a rule: suffix tumah b'rshus hayachid tameh, suffix tumah b'rshus harabim is tahar. So now the shaila is: what is the Beis Hamikdash? Is the Beis Hamikdash rshus hayachid, or is the Beis Hamikdash or rshus harabim? If the Beis Hamikdash is just harabim, then all the oil is tahar. So what's the problem? So now let's learn the halacha.
What's the Hava meaning to say that the Beis Hamikdash was Sharabim? You didn't have 600,000 people going through there every day. You had the Kohanim, you had the Leviim. Maybe you had a few Misnadim. Maybe when it came to the Korban Pesach or Shlosh Golem, Efshir. But on a regular basis, clearly not.
Well, not all Rishonim hold Rishus Harabim is if you have 600,000 people. Many Rishonim hold that Rishus Harabim is even if it's 16 amos.
What?
16 amos or 8 amos.
You mean irrespective of the number of people?
Yes,
just on size.
For example, people want to know how come sometimes you see Bnei Yeshiva, they don't use the Eruv. Do they have a problem with my Eruv? The answer is no, they don't have a problem with your Eruv. They have a problem with an Eruv basically in every city, because most streets are, according to many Rishonim, Rishus Harabim. So according to the Rishonim, let's say that Rishus Harabim is 8 amos wide, so then
Queens Boulevard.
forget about Queens Boulevard, every avenue.
Most of the streets here.
Every single
73rd Avenue.
Every single street would be Rishus Harabim. And we know you can't make an Eruv in a Rishus Harabim, you can only make an Eruv in a Carmelis. So the Mishnah Berurah and the Bir Halacha is actually machmir, not to use an Eruv. Bal Nefesh Yachmir, not to use an Eruv in cities, ever. No problem. It's not that we don't trust the Eruv, it's just you can't make Rishus Harabim in Rishus Harabim. According to, you can't make an Eruv in Rishus Harabim, most streets are Rishus Harabim. So let's say in the yeshiva, they don't say, it's I would say most of the Bachrim are machmir not to use Eruvim. Anywhere. Now the Hasidim happen to be more meiko when it comes to Eruv. I personally, when I was a Bachar, I didn't, and then you get married and you have kids and you don't have a key. But practical issue. It's not. It's a chumrah. It's a legitimate chumrah not to use an eruv when there's a rishus harabim. If a person's able to do it, not questioning the practice of those who use the eruv. Just saying that rishus harabim is not necessarily 600,000 people. Let's see. The Gemara in Pesachim says, in Matzina b'Gemara, she ha'azara nechsheves k'rishus harabim. The azara is considered rishus harabim. Interesting halacha. The azara is considered like rishus harabim. V'lachein safek tuma hamasaraba, and therefore, if you have a safek tuma in the rishus in the azara, tahar. V'imkein madua nitmeu hashmanim. Why then is the oil tameh? V'harei me'achar ve'in ze ela safek haya aleinu likbaya shehem tahirim. We should be kaivea the halacha that the oil is tahar. Presumably, what?
The oil had been out in the Azar?
Well, where is the oil?
When it was needed, what if the honey would do avoda? Would they do avoda out there in the Azar?
They probably had a warehouse for stores of.
Probably store.
They talked about
they had a store.
boxes and stuff like that.
The lishka, right? The lishkais. Because we even remember we learned in the Gemara on Wednesday that they buried the stones of the Mizbeach in the northeast lishka. In the northeast lishka. So this is a question that presumably Rabbi Akiva Eiger is bothered by, to which he says, look in the Rambam. Now, what does the Rambam say? Nirash lakoshazu hiskavein hagoin Rabbi Akiva Eiger begoin hashas. It would appear that this is what Rabbi Akiva Eiger is bothered by. Al asar shetziein ledivrei harambam. He marks to look in the Rambam Parakeh Hilchos Beis HaBechira Halachaches Shekasav Legabe Arba Halishkos. He writes regarding the 4 lishkos Shahayu Ba'arba Miktzaiseha Shal Ezras Nashim that were in the 4 corners of the Ezras Nashim. In other words, the Rambam Hilchos Beis HaBechira writes regarding the 4 lishkos in the 4 corners of Ezras Nashim, Ma'arav Isdraimis, the southwest, Ba'ahayu Noisim Yain V'Shem, they put the oil in the wine, V'hi Hois Nikois Lishkas Beis Shamnaya. V'haloi Lishkas Shamnaya Hayadin Rishus Harabim Latuma. Shaharei Ba'azara Hoisa. V'im Kein Lama Hayatzrichim Neis. See, when Rabbi Akiva Eiger says look in the Rambam, he's not saying look in the Rambam to answer the question, he's saying look in the Rambam to make it a question, because the Rambam says the oil was located in Lishkas Beis Shamnaya. The Lishkas Beis Shamnaya was located in the Azara. So a closet in Rishus Harabim is Rishus Harabim, an area that's a storage area in Rishus Harabim is Rishus Harabim. And therefore Rabbi Akiva Eiger, when he tells you look in the Rambam, meaning if you see the Rambam, you'll be bothered by this question. Presumably the oil was Tameh Misafek, and since it's a Rishus Harabim, it should be Tahar.
So if you have a closet that's locked in the Lishka, so even though the Lishka is in the Azara, which was just Rabbi, if it's a locked closet, doesn't that somehow change the status because you don't have egress, ingress? You know, it's.
You would think, unless it's so small. Look, you would need mechitzos. You would need.
We have a closet; it's closed up, and you have a door with a lock. I mean, doesn't that change it to at least a Carmelis, if not a Rosh Hashanah?
Passively.
Rabbi, there's no explanation of the filed oil was they didn't find a foods. Now, a seal was not broken. So isn't that simple to see? These containers, the seals are broken. They're not broken. So why is it a suffix?
I mean, since the seal was broken, so then raglayim ladavar, then obviously they touched it.
So I don't see the suffix.
But they moved it.
Move it, you said, not just touch it, right?
Well, certainly if you touch, for sure if you touch it, but even if you move it. Well, according to Tosfos, it wasn't enough that it was sealed with the signet of the Kohen Gadol. It had to have been buried also. So if that's the case, that means possibly there were jugs that were sealed but moved. And regarding those jugs that were sealed but not but possibly moved, we're asking it's only a suffix, so they should be tahar. So how does he answer this question? He says, "Herech b'inyan zeh hagoyin Rabbi Yitzchak HaKohen Rappaport, Baal Shal Sechuvas Batei Kahuna." The Goyin Rabbi Yitzchak HaKohen Rappaport, the author of Shal Sechuvas Batei Kahuna, he's Marach Shahoisif Kiav Shebegemara Nemar Timu Kol Shmanim Shebehechal. Even though the Gemara says they were matamei all the oil, Vaday Sheni Kavana Davka Shmanim Shebehechal, it doesn't just mean the Hechal. Ela Afilu Mashari Behechal. Even what was in the Hechal. Ma'at Mezer L'tzarech Halakas Hayemahu. The oil that was stored in the Hechal was the little bit of oil needed for that day. Aval Vaday Shetim Gamas Hashem Shebelishkos Beis Shamnaya. They certainly were matamei also. The oil in the chamber of the Shamnaya. Otherwise, then what's the problem? Just take oil from there. Vimkain, and if so, Hatmiya, he says, the question stands. Why do we need an ace? Why don't we just take the oil out of the lishka, and there, Safek Tomei Shesarabim is Tahar. So the Baal Batei Kahuna answers like this. That when the Rambam says they store the oil in the lishka of Beis Shamnaya, that wasn't the oil for the menorah. That was the oil for the menachos. However, where did they store the oil for the menorah? She'af shalom she'Hashem lamar lo b'lishkas beis shamnai klal, ela dafka Hashem l'menachas. V'ilo Hashem lamar v'heichal haya. Maybe he says the oil for the menorah was stored in the heichal, and that's why the Gemara says l'chein. The Gemara says nakta timu kol hashmanim shebeheichal. In other words, vadai. It's they for sure the oil that was in the base shamnaya. Maybe they weren't matame. The only thing is that oil they couldn't use because that oil was not kasus lamar. That oil was only for the menachos. Now the heichal was not rishus harabim. Maybe the azara, which was open ground for kohanim, levim, and Yisraelim, maybe that's rishus harabim. But the heichal is only for kohanim, tahirim. That's not rishus harabim.
If you hold that the rishus harabim is based upon size alone.
No, but besides that, it was limited access. Heichal in general, limited access. So that was not a rishus harabim. Heichal hoya din rishus harabim. Mishum kach nidma Hashem shehayba. This is very reasonable, and it's almost, slam dunk that this is the pshat.
It makes sense. They wouldn't want to keep the two shmanim together. One is, like you said, much more holy than the other, so there'd be a reason really.
But it's reasonable.
Separate.
One had the CRC and one had the OU.
No.
Yeah.
One couldn't be used for the other.
One was a higher, one was more pure.
Right.
Extra.
Virgin.
Yeah. Okay. Ulam tirutz zeh. This answer does not help for the Shita Rabbeinu Chananel, because Rabbeinu Chananel is goyres k'shenichnasu akum leheichal timu kol shemen shebemikdash. They are matami all the oil in the mikdash. V'gam ha'meiri kosev timu kol shmanim stam.
Didn't Goyim bring korbanos?
Yeah, but I don't know if they brought. Yeah, so.
So the oils in basically just
Doesn't mean they touched the oil. They were allowed to send the carbon to be brought on their behalf. But according to these Rishonim, that they enter, that they were matami all the oil in the mikdash. So if that's the case, that means that the oil for the menorah was stored not specifically in the heichal. And then the question is, how are they matami all the oil in the mikdash, but the lishka and the azara has a din rishus harabim? So there's a sefer on the Gilyon Hashas. The Gilyon Hashas are the amendations, the Hagoyos of Rabbi Kivega on the side of the Gemara. He's very brief. He doesn't tell you what his question is. He doesn't tell you what the answer is. He says, look in the Rambam. From there, you're supposed to figure out he's bothered by a kasha that since the oil's in the lishka, Safek Tomishus Harabim is tahar. And he says, Ayin bebate kahuna, where there's the answer. These are just his personal notes on the Gemara. But Rav Chaim David Shavel, we spoke about him when we had our shiur about Nachmanides and Pablo Crisciani, where we said Rabbi Shavel did a critical work on that particular Sefer Havikuach. So Rabbi Shavel also wrote an annotated work on the Gilyon Hashas of Rabbi Kiva Eger, and he says, no, you're making a mistake. That it's not that we came into the Heichal and everything was in disarray, and therefore we have to assume the worst. Timu kol hashmanim means they went ahead and they intentionally touched. Vadai, we know every single thing was open and moved and defiled. It wasn't a suffix, it was a vadai. He says, mitar suffix tuma nemar shenitmu ashram elo shavadai nitmu. And that's mashra from the Pnei Yeshua and Oid Mefarshim. Timu means not misafik, it means a vadai. Because it was misafik, it would have said nitmeu kol hashmanim shebeheichal. Timu is mashma vadai. Yeah. Now, there is a wondrous teretz that the Marsham gives, a Lomdus teretz, that the Marsham in the Sefer, in his Hagoyis on the Sefer Orchos Chaim, of the Goyin of Nachman Kahana, the Avbezin of Spinka. Okay, here's the answer. What's the pshat that Safek Tumen or Shus HaYachid is Tameh, and Safek Tumen or Shus HaRabim is Tahar? Why? What's the difference? Usually we say Ro Safek Daraisa L'Chumra, Safek Drabanan L'Kula. So, why do we say, when it comes to Tumah, it depends where? It's like some people, do you eat kosher? It depends. At home I eat kosher. Outside of the house I eat seafood. Right? You hear people talk like that. But tumah is tumah. Safek, what's the din of safek? Why does it make a difference? The Rashba says in the first parak of Masechta Nida that the dinim of tumah are learnt out from a saita. We know that when a saita goes into seclusion with another man, so if it's in a makom seisar, we assume the worst. We assume something happened. From there we learn out safek tumah b'rshus hayachid tameh. But if it's in Rishus Harabim, so we don't assume anything about the Saita, and from there we learn out Savik Tumah Rishus Harabim Tahar. So that means the laws of Tumah v'Tahara really parallel the laws of Yichud. If that's the case, even if the Azara is Rishus Harabim, that's in general. What's the halacha? Could one woman be miyached with two men? By Yidden. Why?
Did you think that one would...
One guy. How about could one woman be miyached with two goyim? Oh no.
Then I would one.
No, but even two.
Yeah.
Right? Even two. In other words, by Yidden, one guards the other.
Right.
By goyim not. So kishenichnesh Yavanim lehechal, there are no Yidden, there was all goyim. Memela, even though it's a Rishus Harabim, but Lagabe Yichud, it's considered Rishus Hayachid. It's a place you can't do Yichud. So Memela has a din of Rishus Hayachid, and Safek Tumah is Tameh. Look what he says. Look in Beis. He says in the second paragraph, Me'achar v'din Safek Tumah Rishus Harabim nilmad misaita imkein hu taloi b'dinei Yichud. It's taloi in the laws of Yichud. Umashalei nikra stira lagabe saita, and that which it's not called stira for a saita, whatever is not considered yichud for a saita, nechshav krishus harabim l'inyan tuma is considered like rishus harabim lagabe tuma. Vim kain, and if so, kivan shabashah shenichnasu hayivanim lehechal. Since at the time that the Yivanim entered the hechal, lo hayasham Yehudim klal, there were no Jews at all. And the din is it's also for a woman to be miyachid with many goyim. Even though it's really Rishus Harabim, but it depends on the laws of Yichud, and at that time there was an Isser Yichud in the Azara, therefore that din Rishus Hayachid, and therefore Safek Tumah is Tameh.
You know, if you apply what we learned on Wednesday, it would be hard to say this because you would expect that since 99.9% of the Yidden were assimilation, and they followed all these, right? That they probably went in with them and showed them what to do.
Yes, I was thinking about that. That's a very important point. In other words, a little bit you see from this sugya, not like what we were learning on Wednesday. For example, Tosfos discusses, were they geyser on Goyim, Tumas Hesed or not? Wait a second. The Baal Amor says, and the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, when it says that She'an She'yavan Meshaketz es HaMizbeach, so he asks, Goyim can't be Meshaketz. So he says it wasn't the Goyim. An She'yavan means the Mesyavnim. So if that's the case, so who is Matame Kashmanim Shebehechal? According to the Baal Amor, maybe it was the Yidden were Matame Kashmanim Shebehechal. I mean, Tosfos clearly is not learning like that because Tosfos wants to know were they goyzer on goyim to have a din of a zav or not. What do you mean? We're not dealing with the goyim here. So if you're dealing with Yidden, could be the Yidden or Matameyet. Anyway, it's a very interesting point. Okay, I'm going to tell you another answer here. This answer is brought down in the Yeshurun journal, Elul Tavshin Samach. And this is a teretz of Rabbi Yisachar Doiver Keach of Belz. The Rashba says that the reason why Safek Tumah B'Shus Hayachid is Tameh and Safek Tumah B'Shus Haram is Tahar is it's learnt out from the dinim of a Saita. Tosfos says a different Lomdus. Tosfos quotes Yushalmi and Saita Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis. Why is Safek Tumah? What would you say if I were to ask you for your gut reaction? Safek Tumah, should it be Tameh or Tahar? What would you say?
Tameh.
Why?
Because you want to be restrictive and not take the chance.
Because Safek Daraisa. Safek Daraisa L'chumra. So then why Safek Tumah B'Shus Harabim Tahar? So Tosfos says like this. Since there's a halacha that Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor, what's the law of Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor? That if the majority of Klal Yisrael is Tumah, you're allowed to do the Avodah B'Tumah. So if, when Klal Yisrael is Vadai Tameh, for a Tzibor you could be Mekel and do the Avodah B'Tumah, then certainly by Safek, in Rishus Harabim, it's also Tahar. That's the logic. The logic is, since we see we're Mekel by Tumah to a Tzibor, that when it's Safek Tumah, that by Vadai Tumah, that Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor, so certainly Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim should be Tahar. There's some logic, we're extrapolating. We see when we deal with the Tzibor at large, we're Mekel Lagabe Tumah V'Haraya, Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor. So let's extrapolate that certainly Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim is Tahar.
I don't see the jump.
Tosfos makes a Kal V'chomer. I don't know. It's certainly something you could question. I mean, we could think about. Is that a perfect analogy? That just because Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor, certainly Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim should be Tahar. But that's the Lomdus of Tosfos. Mamela. Right, you got that's the equation. Whether you agree that E equals MC squared, but accept that equation. The equation is if Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor, certainly Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim is Tahar. If Vadai is Tahar, certainly Safek. So says the Belzer Rebbe Ga'inus. Question is, why the Pnei Yeshua asks, why did the Rebbe Shalom have to make a miracle that oil that should have lasted for one day lasts for 8 days? Just use Tameh oil because Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor. And the answer is, we didn't want to rely on Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor. We want to do things Mahajin and Mahajin. We don't want to rely on the klal of Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor. So says the Belzer Rebbe, the whole rule that Safek Da'iraisa, Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim Tahar, is learnt out from the rule of Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor. So if Klal Yisrael didn't want to rely on the Lomdus of Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor, Memela they can't make the Kal V'chomer that Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim is Tahar. It's like a combination Lomdus and Drush. It's an interesting thought. That, in other words, there's a famous question. The question is, since Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor, the whole miracle is unnecessary. And the answer the Pnei Yeshua gives, and the Chacham Tzvi gives, is they don't want to rely on that rule. So if you don't want to rely on the rule that Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor, but Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor is the source for how we know Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim is Tahar. So we can't make that Kal V'chomer anymore because we don't rely on the principle of Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor, so we can't extend that to Safek Tumah is Tahar.
But if you follow that line of reasoning, then the Bnei Yisrael should have waited the number of days necessary to actually be sure that they had Vadai Shemen that was Flamor.
They did.
No, they used the one that they found right away for the first day.
Oh, that was good, because that one was good. That was sealed with the signet of the Kohen Gadol. That one was buried, and they knew that it wasn't touched. Okay, one more answer. This is looking in Ois Dalid from Rav Avram Gottesman, the Baal Ponim Masbiros. Tosfos in Soita says that even in Rishus Harabim at night, it has a din of Rishus HaYachid. Now the question is, when the Yevanim went into the Heichal, when did they go in? We don't know, but certainly the nighttime passed. So the halacha is that even if you have a suffix tumah rishus harabim, but once the nighttime passes, since during the night the halacha is suffix tumah is tameh, then from then on it becomes tameh. So presumably a nighttime passed, and then we would apply the rule that when the nighttime passes, we would say that it's tameh. He says la'ar zois, in light of this, tiritz hagoyin bal panam asbiros inyan noisaf. The panam asbiros explains an added point, that the Rambam in Parag Gimel of Hilchos Tmidim Musafim says that even in the morning you have to light the neiros. Shenemar the hikter alav aroin ketoira samim baboiker be'ativas haneiros. Right, it's an interesting halacha. Very interesting halacha. You know, the Rambam shita is that halakas hamanoira in the Beis Hamikdash was not only during the night; it was also during the day as well. I don't think everybody agrees with that, but that's the shita of the Rambam, that there's a mitzvah of halakas haneiros in the morning as well.
How come you say like in
Why do I say that's a chiddush? What? Because what does it say? V'hikter olav Aaron ketoira samim ba'boiker b'heitivoyas haneiros. So literally, you would think it means he's maktir the ketoras when he cleans the neiros. Then in the morning he's just meitiv. But the Rambam learns that hatava is also hadlaka. So he asked the Panam Asbiros a very interesting question. Since in the Beis Hamikdash they lit the menorah according to the Rambam in the night and the day, so ask a kasha on the Rambam. According to the Rambam, why weren't they misakin that we should light the menorah at night and during the day? Why do we only light the menorah during the nighttime?
Does that mean you're going to put it out, or you don't put enough oil in to last the whole day?
Who, us? I'm saying
No, in the
mikdash? Yeah, it only lasted till the morning, let's say. Who says it lasted the whole night? In the shul they do it, but why don't we do it, right? What?
Depends how much oil you put in. The kaftor or...
Yeah, so presumably they put in till the morning. So if lighting our menorahs is in commemoration of the Beis HaMikdash, so I understand, isn't this a raya to the Rishonim that in the Beis HaMikdash they only lit at night? Because if they lit during the day as well, why weren't they masaking that we should light during the day? So says the Panam Asbiros, listen to this beautiful teretz. Because during the day there's no miracle. You know why? Because during the day they could have used the oil. Because suffix Tomar B'Shus Harabim is tar. The miracle is only needed for the nighttime, because in the nighttime suffix Tomar B'Shus Harabim is tameh. So that's why they were only masaking to light the menorah in the nighttime. Because for the day it wasn't. Also, you say during the day there's no Persumei Nisa.
Well,
He says it's doichik to say, right? There's a concept, shraga batara mai mahani, a torch during the day doesn't help. But still, that's the reason why. So he suggests.
But I mean, in terms of the real avoda, did they light?
Yeah, they lit
the first Beis HaMikdash twice. They lit.
Yes. According to the Rambam, they lit during the day as well.
But according to most others,
we shine them only in the nighttime.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, Rabbi says, so here's a little flavor of the Lomdus of Chanukah. I'll leave you off with a question. In Shulchan Aruch, what comes first? Chanukah or Purim? In Shulchan Aruch, what comes first? Chanukah or Purim? Chanukah. The last siman in Orach Chaim is Hilchos Purim, right? V'toiv leiv mishtat tamid. So Orach Chaim ends off with Hilchos Purim. Chanukah comes before Hilchos Purim. In the Rambam, what comes first? In the Rambam, what comes first? 50-50. In the Rambam, what comes first?
Usually the coin.
Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah. Kriyas HaMegillah, and then Hilchos Chanukah. So we have a machlokes here between the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam. The Shulchan Aruch puts Chanukah. Now, which would you put first?
If you follow the calendar, you put Hanukkah first. So start with Nisan, right?
No,
If you start with Nisan, then Purim is in the last day. That's maybe why the Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam does not. The Rambam puts Chanukah first. The Rambam, follows the order of the calendar. Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam follows the order of
when it happened.
When it happened, then Purim would be first.
Purim came before Chanukah.
Yeah.
So the Rambam puts first Purim, and then Chanukah is really the last of all the miracles. On the other hand, the calendar uses the other way, goes the other way around. Okay, Rabbi say, let's hold it over here. Afreilchen Chanukah.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.